He didn't bark. He just stared at the general for 10 minutes straight. The room did not understand silence like this, the kind that feels heavier than sound itself, as if every breath inside it had been measured, weighed, and judged before being allowed to exist. The briefing chamber at Naval Support Command in Quantico, Virginia was built for discipline, glass walls, polished steel, and the kind of lighting that never softened anything it touched. Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson stood behind reinforced observation glass, hands locked behind his back, posture rigid in a way that came from years of training and years of learning when not to speak. His eyes never left the white-coated German shepherd in the center of the room. They called him Ghost, a K-9 unit with a coat so pale it almost seemed unreal under the fluorescent ceiling panels, his amber eyes fixed forward without blinking, locked directly on General William Hartley. The general did not move at first either. He was seated at the long oak table, surrounded by officers and analysts who pretended not to react to the unusual stillness unfolding in front of them. Papers were open, tablets dimmed, pens paused mid-note. The air conditioning hummed like a distant engine that had forgotten its purpose. 10 minutes was a long time in a military setting. Long enough for questions to turn into suspicion, and suspicion into something far more dangerous than either. Marcus knew that time was not just passing, it was being counted. Every second Ghost held that stare was another second closer to judgment. A soft voice had already announced the protocol before the meeting began, a behavioral evaluation under controlled conditions, standard procedure for a K-9 unit flag during a classified logistics review. Ghost had been assigned to Marcus during overseas deployment, operating in environments where trust was not spoken, only proven. But something had changed in the records 3 days ago, something that had brought them here. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, just enough for the fabric of his uniform to whisper against itself, and immediately regretted it. Ghost's ears twitched, not breaking eye contact with the general, but acknowledging something only Marcus would have recognized. That small response was enough to tighten Marcus's chest. He remembered another place, another time, where silence meant survival. Dust-heavy air, distant radio static, the weight of not knowing what comes next. Ghost had been there too, moving without hesitation, reading danger faster than any human voice could confirm it. But here, in this controlled environment of polished authority and procedural calm, there was no visible danger. Only questions. General Hartley finally leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together with deliberate precision. His voice, when it came, did not break the silence so much as reshape it. He asked for confirmation of behavioral stability, as if speaking to the room more than to the animal. Ghost did not react. He simply continued to stare, unflinching, unwavering, as though the answer he was looking for had nothing to do with spoken language. Marcus felt a tightening in his stomach as one of the analysts began to quietly note the duration. 5 minutes had already passed when Ghost took a single step forward. It was not aggressive. It was not uncertain. It was intentional, measured, like a decision that had been delayed long enough. The room's attention shifted, almost imperceptibly, but completely. Even the air seemed to change density. Marcus's pulse struck harder in his throat. Ghost stopped again, now closer to the table, still looking at Hartley. The general did not flinch, but something in his expression narrowed, a subtle recalibration of recognition, as if memory was trying to surface beneath discipline. The silence deepened instead of breaking. It grew roots. It filled corners of the room that sound could not reach. Marcus thought of Ghost's training logs, of nights spent in field conditions where commands were unnecessary because instinct had already spoken first. And beneath that, something older, something Marcus had never fully understood, a connection that did not fit into reports or evaluations. At exactly 10 minutes, the room's clock clicked softly, marking the completion of the observation window. No one spoke. Ghost still had not moved his gaze. The general inhaled slowly, as if preparing to dismiss the moment as inconclusive data, but before any order could be given, Ghost lifted his front paw and held it suspended in the air with a calm precision that did not belong to randomness or confusion. It was deliberate, controlled, and unmistakably intentional. Every person in the room froze. Marcus felt his breath stop before he understood why. The gesture was not in the protocol. It was not in any training manual. It was something else entirely, something that reached beyond command structures and evaluations. General Hartley's eyes narrowed further, but this time not in authority, but in recognition, as though a buried file in his memory had just been forced open by a signal he thought no longer existed. The paw remained raised, steady, unwavering, like a code waiting to be understood. No one in the room moved when the white German shepherd held his paw suspended in the air, steady as if time itself had been asked to wait. The fluorescent lights above continued their indifferent hum, but everything beneath them had shifted into something fragile and unspoken. General William Hartley's eyes remained fixed on the animal, yet the authority in his posture had changed in a way that was almost imperceptible, like a structure realizing it had been built on a memory instead of a foundation. Marcus Johnson, still behind the observation glass, felt his throat tighten as he watched the general's expression narrow, not in suspicion anymore, but in recognition that arrived too late to be comfortable. Ghost did not break eye contact. His amber eyes carried no aggression, no confusion, only a calm persistence that felt older than the room itself. One of the analysts lowered his pen without realizing it, the motion slow and absent-minded, as if his body had forgotten what it was meant to record. Another officer leaned forward slightly, then stopped himself, unsure why the gesture felt inappropriate. The general finally spoke, but his voice was quieter than before, stripped of its procedural tone. He asked a simple question, directed not to the room, but to the space between himself and the dog, where meaning seemed to be suspended. Marcus felt the question before he heard it fully, because it carried weight that did not belong to the present moment. Ghost did not respond with sound. Instead, his raised paw shifted slightly, adjusting angle, precise and deliberate, as though correcting a signal that had been misunderstood for too long. That small adjustment broke something open in General Hartley's expression. Not shock, not fear, but the unmistakable stillness of someone who had stepped into a corridor of memory they had spent years trying to lock away. Marcus saw it then, not as a reaction, but as a fracture in time. His mind was pulled backward without permission, into fragments he had never spoken aloud. He remembered desert air thick with heat, a temporary operations compound that smelled of metal and dust, and a set of coded gestures used only in one classified unit that no longer existed in any official record. Operation Black Hound had never been briefed in open channels, never acknowledged in standard reports, and yet Ghost had once been part of it, not as equipment, not as asset, but as witness. Marcus swallowed hard as the realization tightened in his chest. Ghost had not been reacting to the general. He had been responding to something buried beneath the general's authority, something older than rank. General Hartley leaned forward slightly now, elbows resting on the table, his gaze locked on Ghost's raised paw, as though it were a document written in a language he had once been fluent in, but had not spoken for years. His voice came again, slower this time, each word carefully placed, asking where that signal had come from, not as an order, but as a question that carried personal weight. Ghost did not move. He held his position with the patience of something that did not measure time in minutes. Marcus felt his pulse in his fingertips now, subtle but insistent, as the silence in the room transformed from evaluation into confrontation with memory itself. The analysts had stopped writing entirely. One of them looked toward the general, searching for instruction that did not arrive. Another glanced at Marcus through the glass, as if he might somehow provide context for something that existed beyond explanation. But Marcus had none to give. All he had was the knowledge that Ghost had never forgotten anything, even things the system had attempted to erase. The general's gaze finally shifted upward, just slightly, meeting Ghost's eyes directly for the first time without protocol as a barrier. When he spoke again, his voice was almost unrecognizable in its restraint. He asked the question differently this time, not as commander, not as evaluator, but as someone standing on the edge of a truth they had long avoided. Ghost's paw remained raised, unwavering, until the slightest shift in his posture suggested not insistence, but confirmation. Marcus realized then that this was not a test being conducted by the room. It was a message being delivered to it, and the only reason it could be understood at all was because someone in that room had once been part of its origin. The air felt heavier now, not with tension, but with recognition delayed too long to remain comfortable. And still, no one spoke a conclusion, because none of them were certain they were allowed to. The silence in the observation chamber had begun to change shape, no longer a frozen moment of evaluation, but something more unstable, like a memory being forced into the present against its will. Ghost still held his paw raised, perfectly steady, as though the gesture itself had become a point of balance between two different histories. General William Hartley did not look away, but his breathing had slowed in a way that suggested he was no longer in full command of the present room. Marcus Johnson watched from behind the reinforced glass, his hands now no longer fully under control, fingers slightly curled as if he were bracing for impact from something invisible. The analysts remained silent, but their stillness had shifted from professional observation to hesitant awareness, the kind that appears when a system realizes it is no longer the highest authority in the room. Ghost's amber eyes remained locked on the general, unwavering, patient, almost like he was waiting for permission to complete something that had been interrupted years ago rather than minutes ago. The general finally leaned back slightly, breaking the rigid forward posture he had maintained since the beginning of the evaluation. His gaze softened just enough to reveal something buried beneath decades of rank and discipline, something personal that had not been accessed in a long time. He spoke again, but this time his voice carried a lower tone, not commanding, but careful, as if each word had to pass through layers of memory before reaching the air. Marcus felt the shift immediately, because he had heard that tone before, not in this room, but in fragmented recollections of field briefings that were never recorded in official archives. Ghost responded by lowering his raised paw slowly, placing it back onto the polished floor with deliberate control. The movement was not an ending, but a transition, as if the signal had been acknowledged and now required interpretation. General Hartley's eyes narrowed slightly, then widened by a fraction, the smallest visible sign of recognition breaking through restraint. He asked a question that was no longer about behavior, but about origin, about where the gesture had been learned, and why it had returned now, after so many years of silence. Marcus felt his stomach tighten, because he understood that question carried weight far beyond this evaluation. Ghost took a step forward, not toward aggression, but toward proximity, closing the distance between himself and the table by less than 2 feet. Yet that small movement shifted the atmosphere entirely. The analysts exchanged brief glances, unsure whether protocol still applied in a moment that was clearly no longer procedural. General Hartley did not instruct them to stop observing, but he also did not acknowledge them anymore, as if the room had narrowed to only 2 points of reference, himself and the dog. Marcus pressed closer to the glass, his breath fogging slightly against the reinforced surface, though he did not notice it. His attention was fully consumed by Ghost's posture, which had become still again, but in a different way than before. This stillness was not waiting, it was remembering. The general slowly reached forward and placed both hands on the table, fingers spread slightly, grounding himself physically as if preparing to face something that could not be addressed through rank or regulation. His voice dropped further, now almost conversational, stripped of all institutional framing, and he repeated the question, not as a demand, but as a recognition that something long buried had resurfaced without permission. Ghost tilted his head slightly, just enough to suggest acknowledgement. Marcus felt a tight pressure behind his ribs, because he realized that what was unfolding was not a test being passed or failed, but a convergence of histories that had never fully separated. The general's expression changed again, this time with a faint trace of something that resembled disbelief held in place by discipline. He looked briefly toward the observation glass, toward Marcus, and for a moment their eyes met through layers of reinforced transparency and institutional distance. In that brief connection, Marcus understood something without words, that whatever Ghost was signaling had once belonged to a structure of operations that no longer officially existed, and yet had never truly disappeared from memory. Ghost remained still, his presence steady, not demanding interpretation, but refusing to be dismissed. The room no longer felt like an evaluation chamber. It felt like a space where something unfinished had returned to demand recognition. And in that quiet tension, no one present was certain whether they were witnessing a conclusion or the beginning of something that had been waiting far too long to be acknowledged. The chamber felt less like a controlled military environment now and more like a sealed memory that had been opened without permission, letting something long dormant circulate through the air again. General William Hartley remained standing at the edge of the table, his hands no longer resting in authority, but hovering slightly above the surface, as if he was unsure whether contact with reality would stabilize him or break him further. Ghost had lowered his head slightly, but his presence remained firm, anchored in a stillness that did not belong to hesitation or obedience, but to recognition. Marcus Johnson stood behind the observation glass, no longer focused on protocol or evaluation metrics, but entirely consumed by the subtle changes in the general's expression. What Marcus saw now was not confusion, but the gradual collapse of distance between past and present. The general exhaled slowly, and in that exhale there was a shift that carried more weight than any command he had ever issued. He asked Ghost a question again, but it was no longer procedural. It was personal in a way that military language rarely allowed. The words were careful, shaped as if they had been stored for years and were now being released under pressure. Ghost responded not with sound, but by stepping closer again, closing the remaining space between himself and the table until he was within arm's reach. The movement was calm, deliberate, and entirely unthreatening, yet it altered the atmosphere so completely that even the analysts stopped breathing normally. Marcus felt his chest tighten, because he realized Ghost was not reacting to the present conversation at all. He was continuing something that had started long before this room existed in its current form. General Hartley's gaze dropped briefly to Ghost's collar, then returned to his eyes. That small movement seemed to unlock something deeper, because his voice softened further, and for the first time, he did not sound like a general addressing a unit, but like a man confronting an unresolved chapter of his own life. Marcus saw it then, faint but undeniable, the flicker of memory returning through discipline. He remembered fragments of briefings that were never recorded in official archives, names that were never entered into personnel logs, and a unit that operated under conditions that demanded silence even from history itself. Ghost had been part of that structure, not as equipment, not as asset, but as a living participant in operations that relied on trust beyond language. The general slowly sat back down, not because he was finished, but because standing no longer provided stability. His hands came together again, but this time there was no precision in the gesture, only the attempt to contain something that had expanded beyond control. He looked at Marcus briefly through the glass, and Marcus understood immediately that what was unfolding had nothing to do with the current evaluation. It was a recognition event, triggered by a signal that should have remained buried. Ghost remained motionless, his amber eyes steady, as if waiting for acknowledgement to complete a cycle that had been interrupted years earlier. The room itself seemed to narrow, the edges of perception tightening around the 3 points of connection: Ghost, General Hartley, and Marcus. The analysts, once confident in their procedural roles, now appeared uncertain where observation ended and participation began. The general finally spoke again, and this time his voice carried something almost fragile beneath its controlled surface. He referenced a designation that Marcus had only ever heard in classified debrief fragments, a term associated with operations that were officially dissolved and never publicly acknowledged. Ghost responded by shifting his weight slightly, not as confirmation in the traditional sense, but as recognition of identity. Marcus felt a sudden pressure in his thoughts, as though understanding was trying to form faster than language could support it. The general leaned forward again, but slowly, carefully, as if approaching something that might disappear if moved toward too quickly. His eyes did not leave Ghost's face, and for a moment, the hierarchy of the room no longer applied. There was no observer and subject, no command and compliance. There was only recognition across time. Ghost's posture remained unchanged, but something in the quality of his stillness had shifted. It was no longer waiting for instruction. It was waiting for acceptance. Marcus realized that the gesture Ghost had made earlier, the raised paw, was not a test, not a trick, but a signal rooted in a language that existed outside conventional military communication. A language built on trust, repetition, and shared experience in environments where words were unreliable. The general closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, there was a subtle change, as if he had decided to allow a truth to exist that had been suppressed for too long. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he nodded once, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but deliberately enough that the entire room registered it. Ghost lowered his head slightly in response, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. Marcus felt something release in his chest, not relief, but recognition of a truth that had finally been allowed to surface. The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was complete, as if the room itself had accepted that some answers do not arrive through explanation, but through recognition that cannot be undone. The room remained still in a way that no longer felt like hesitation, but like acceptance, as if everyone present had collectively crossed a threshold they could not return from without acknowledging what they had just witnessed. General William Hartley kept his gaze lowered for several seconds after his slow nod, his hands resting on the table without tension now, no longer performing authority, but simply occupying space within it. Ghost stood quietly in front of him, his white coat catching the sterile light in a way that made him appear almost unreal, yet his presence was steady, grounded, undeniably intentional. Marcus Johnson remained behind the reinforced glass, his posture unchanged, but his mind no longer operating within the boundaries of evaluation or protocol. He was no longer watching a test. He was witnessing recognition that had been delayed across years, compressed into a single moment of impossible clarity. The general finally spoke again, but his voice was no longer shaped by command structure. It carried a weight of acknowledgement, as if each word had to pass through layers of memory before reaching the present. He did not look at the analysts when he spoke. He did not issue instruction. He simply stated a designation that Marcus immediately recognized as belonging to a program that had never existed in any public record. Ghost responded by shifting his stance slightly, not in reaction, but in alignment, as though the mention itself completed a circuit that had remained open for too long. Marcus felt a quiet tightening in his chest, because the realization was no longer forming, it had fully arrived. The general leaned back slightly again, but this time the movement did not signal withdrawal. It signaled acceptance of something larger than himself. He looked at Ghost with a different expression now, one that carried the subtle burden of responsibility rather than authority. The room's analysts remained silent, their attention no longer directed at documentation or observation, but at the unfolding exchange that defied procedural classification. One of them slowly lowered his tablet onto the table, abandoning the pretense of recording something that could not be properly captured in data fields. Ghost took another step forward, closing the remaining distance until he stood directly in front of the general's position. The movement was calm, controlled, and precise, but it carried a finality that made the air feel denser. Marcus noticed his own breathing had slowed without intention, as if his body had adapted to the rhythm of the moment rather than the other way around. General Hartley did not speak immediately. Instead, he extended his hand slightly, not as an order, not as a command, but as an invitation. Ghost hesitated for a fraction of a second, a pause so small it almost did not exist, and then placed his paw forward into the general's hand. The contact was simple, physical, unremarkable in appearance, yet it caused a shift in the room that no one could ignore. It was not confirmation of obedience. It was confirmation of memory. Marcus felt a sudden clarity rise in his thoughts, because what he was witnessing was no longer about evaluation or protocol. It was about continuity between past operations and present truth. The general's expression softened further, and for the first time since the beginning of the session, he exhaled in a way that sounded like release rather than control. He spoke Ghost's designation again, but this time it carried no uncertainty. It carried recognition that had survived silence, classification, and time itself. Ghost remained still, his paw resting in the general's hand, his amber eyes steady and calm, as if he had finally reached the point he had been moving toward since the moment he entered the room. Marcus stepped closer to the glass without realizing it, his focus narrowing entirely on the exchange. He understood now that what had unfolded was not an anomaly in behavior, but the resurfacing of an unbroken bond formed in conditions that no longer officially existed. The analysts exchanged no words. None were necessary. The moment had surpassed documentation. General Hartley slowly lowered Ghost's paw, but his hand did not leave contact immediately. There was a brief pause, not of procedure, but of understanding. When he finally released it, Ghost remained still, not retreating, not advancing, simply present. Marcus felt something settle inside him that he could not immediately define. It was not resolution, and it was not conclusion. It was recognition that some connections do not end when systems are dissolved or records are erased. They remain, waiting for the moment when they are no longer questioned. The room stayed quiet, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of acknowledgement, where nothing more needed to be proven. The moment Ghost's paw left the general's hand, the room did not return to normal. It simply settled into a new kind of reality, one where nothing could be unseen or ununderstood again. General William Hartley remained still, his hand hovering briefly in the space where contact had just ended, as if the absence of that weight carried more meaning than its presence. His eyes stayed on Ghost, but they were no longer evaluating, no longer measuring. They were remembering. Marcus Johnson watched from behind the reinforced glass. His entire focus narrowed to the subtle shift in the general's breathing, the way his shoulders no longer held the same rigid command structure they had carried at the beginning of the session. Ghost stood quietly in front of him, perfectly composed, his white coat illuminated under the clinical lighting, but his posture had changed in a way that was almost imperceptible. It was no longer the posture of response. It was the posture of completion. The analysts remained silent, their earlier procedural confidence replaced by something more uncertain, a hesitation that came from realizing they were no longer recording data, but witnessing meaning. General Hartley finally broke his gaze from Ghost and looked down at the table, his fingers slowly curling inward as if grounding himself in something physical. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with rank or authority. It carried memory. He referenced a designation again, but this time it was not spoken as classification. It was spoken as recognition. Marcus felt a shift in his chest, because the name of that operation was not supposed to exist in any active awareness. It belonged to a sealed history, one that had been deliberately removed from institutional continuity. Yet here it was, returning not through documentation, but through presence. Ghost did not react outwardly, but his ears adjusted slightly, a subtle acknowledgement that suggested comprehension far deeper than training protocols allowed. The general leaned forward again, but slower this time, as if approaching something fragile rather than commanding it. His eyes did not leave Ghost, and when he spoke again, it was no longer to the room. It was directed entirely at the space between himself and the dog. Marcus realized then that what was unfolding was not an evaluation being concluded, but a connection being confirmed. Ghost took a small step backward, not in retreat, but in adjustment, as if aligning himself with a memory that had just been fully acknowledged. The room's lighting seemed unchanged, but the atmosphere had shifted so significantly that even the analysts no longer attempted to interact with their devices. One had set his tablet aside entirely. Another simply watched, hands still, eyes fixed on the interaction as if waiting for the rules of observation to reassert themselves. They did not. General Hartley exhaled slowly, and when he spoke again, there was a faint trace of something that resembled relief beneath the discipline. He did not explain what had happened. He did not need to. The recognition was already complete within him. Marcus stepped slightly closer to the glass without realizing it, his reflection merging faintly with the scene beyond, as if he too had become part of the boundary between observation and participation. Ghost turned his head slightly toward Marcus for the first time since entering the room, and in that brief movement there was no uncertainty, only acknowledgement. It was not a command, not a signal, but a shared understanding that existed outside structured communication. General Hartley followed Ghost's gaze briefly, then looked back at him, and in that exchange something unspoken passed through the room, something that could not be recorded or formalized. The general slowly lowered his hands onto the table again, but this time there was no tension in the gesture. It was grounding, not control. He spoke a final time, not as a directive, but as confirmation of what had already been accepted. Ghost remained still, absorbing nothing, resisting nothing, simply existing within the moment as though it had always been leading here. Marcus felt the weight in his chest ease slightly, though he could not define whether what he was feeling was resolution or realization. The analysts did not move. No one attempted to restart the evaluation process, because everyone in the room understood without needing to say it, that the evaluation had already ended the moment recognition replaced uncertainty. The silence that followed was no longer charged. It was complete, like something finally placed back into its rightful place after years of being lost. The silence that followed felt different now, not like uncertainty waiting to be resolved, but like something already understood and simply not yet spoken aloud. General William Hartley remained seated, his posture no longer rigid but naturally grounded, as if the weight of command had shifted from his shoulders to something deeper and more personal. Ghost stood in front of him without movement, his white coat reflecting the overhead lights in soft, almost muted tones, his amber eyes no longer scanning or assessing, but resting in a calm that suggested completion rather than anticipation. Marcus Johnson, still behind the reinforced observation glass, felt the tension in his body begin to dissolve in small increments, though his mind remained alert, trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he had been trained to understand. The analysts around the table had stopped interacting with their equipment entirely. One had placed both hands flat on the surface in front of him, not as a gesture of authority, but as if anchoring himself to something that no longer followed procedural structure. General Hartley finally broke his gaze from Ghost and looked down at the table, his expression no longer shaped by command or evaluation, but by something quieter and more human. When he spoke, his voice carried a restrained heaviness, as if each word was being chosen not for clarity, but for acceptance. He did not reference protocol. He did not reference outcome. He referenced memory. Marcus felt the shift immediately, because the general was no longer speaking to the room. He was speaking to something that existed behind it. Ghost tilted his head slightly, a subtle motion that suggested recognition without need for explanation. The general continued, this time slower, acknowledging a designation that Marcus understood was not meant to exist in any active operational context. The name of that program was not supposed to be spoken aloud, yet here it was, returning not as classified data, but as lived truth. Ghost's posture remained unchanged, but there was a softness in his stillness now, as if the act of being recognized had resolved something that had remained unresolved for years. Marcus took a step closer to the glass without realizing it, his attention fully locked on the exchange, no longer as an observer of procedure, but as a witness to restoration. The general leaned back slightly, his shoulders lowering as if a long-held tension had finally found release. He looked at Ghost again, and this time the gaze carried no uncertainty, only acknowledgement. The room itself seemed to adjust to this shift, as if the environment had recalibrated around a new understanding that did not require documentation to be valid. One of the analysts exhaled quietly, the sound barely noticeable, yet in the absolute quiet of the chamber it felt significant. Ghost took a small step forward again, not in response to command, but in continuation of something already established. General Hartley did not react with surprise. Instead, he accepted the movement as confirmation, his expression softening further into something that resembled recognition long delayed but finally received. Marcus felt an unfamiliar stillness settle in his chest, not emptiness, but clarity, as if the confusion that had been building across the previous moments had finally resolved into something coherent. The general spoke once more, but his voice was now steady, no longer carrying the weight of uncertainty. It was not instruction, and it was not assessment. It was acknowledgement of a bond that had existed beyond formal structure, beyond recorded history, beyond the boundaries of institutional memory. Ghost remained still, his amber eyes steady and calm, reflecting no urgency, no tension, only presence. The analysts no longer attempted to interpret. They simply observed, as if understanding had already been reached collectively without need for further analysis. Marcus noticed the general's hands resting fully on the table now, no longer gripping or controlling, but simply present in the space. It was a posture of acceptance rather than authority. Ghost's gaze finally softened slightly, and in that subtle change there was a sense that whatever had been fragmented had now been made whole again. The silence that filled the room was no longer heavy. It was complete, like a conclusion that did not need to be declared because it had already been understood by everyone who mattered in that moment. The room did not return to what it had been before, because something irreversible had already settled into it, not as an event, but his understanding that could no longer be unlearned. General William Hartley remained seated, his posture now fully relaxed in a way that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the session. His hands rested on the table without tension, fingers no longer arranged in control, but simply present, as if he had finally stopped resisting what the moment required of him. Ghost stood quietly in front of him, his white coat still glowing softly under the clinical lights, but his presence no longer felt like a subject under evaluation. It felt like a witness that had finished testifying. Marcus Johnson, still behind the reinforced glass, had not moved in several minutes, his attention locked not on procedure, but on the absence of procedure itself. The analysts remained silent, their devices forgotten, their roles temporarily suspended by something that had no entry in any operational manual. General Hartley finally exhaled, a slow and deliberate release that carried the weight of decisions made long before this room existed in its current form. When he spoke, his voice was no longer structured by authority or hierarchy. It carried the tone of acknowledgement, as if he were confirming something that had been true all along, but required this exact moment to be spoken aloud. He referenced the designation once more, but this time without hesitation, without caution, and without the need for classification language. Ghost did not respond outwardly, but his posture shifted slightly, not in reaction, but in alignment, as though the acknowledgement completed a long, unfinished loop. Marcus felt a quiet pressure in his chest ease, not because clarity had fully arrived, but because confusion was no longer in control of the moment. The general leaned back slightly, his gaze lifting from Ghost to somewhere beyond the immediate room, as if he were seeing layers of time stacked behind the present. When he spoke again, it was not to explain, but to confirm continuity, the existence of a unit that had operated beyond documentation, where memory and trust replaced formal record-keeping. Ghost remained still, but there was a calm assurance in his presence now that suggested recognition was not new to him, only finally acknowledged by those who had once shared it. Marcus shifted slightly closer to the glass, his reflection faint against the observation surface, merging briefly with the scene beyond. He understood now that what he was witnessing was not an anomaly in behavior or a breakdown in protocol, but the resurfacing of a structure that had been deliberately dissolved in paperwork, but never truly erased in reality. One of the analysts finally lowered his voice, not to report, but to ask a quiet question that carried more uncertainty than authority. The general did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Ghost with a stillness that felt almost reflective, as if he were weighing not facts, but meaning. Ghost responded by taking a single step forward, not toward command, not toward evaluation, but toward presence itself, closing the distance in a way that felt intentional yet peaceful. General Hartley raised his hand slightly, not as instruction, but as acknowledgement of what that movement represented. There was no need for further demonstration. The connection had already been established. Marcus felt something shift internally, a realization that what had unfolded was not about proving capability or validating history, but about confirming that certain bonds exist outside formal recognition systems. The general finally spoke Marcus's name, not as an order, but as inclusion, drawing him into the moment not as an observer, but as someone whose history was also part of what had just been uncovered. Marcus swallowed, stepping back from the glass instinctively, as if distance could help him process what proximity had already made clear. Ghost remained calm, his amber eyes steady, now resting not on any single person, but on the space between them, as if he understood that the meaning of the moment belonged equally to all who were present. The analysts did not move. No one attempted to restore procedural structure, because it was understood without being said that structure had already been replaced by recognition. General Hartley finally stood, slowly, without urgency, and when he did, it was not to conclude the session, but to acknowledge its transformation. He looked once more at Ghost, and in that final exchange there was no hierarchy remaining, only mutual understanding shaped by time, experience, and silence that had finally been given permission to end. The room remained still after that, but it was no longer a stillness of uncertainty. It was the stillness of something fully seen, fully accepted, and no longer in need of explanation. The room did not change back after the silence settled. because silence like that does not reverse itself. It only expands until everyone inside it learns how to live within its shape. General William Hartley stood for a moment longer, his hand still resting near the edge of the table, not as a sign of authority, but as if he needed something physical to confirm that what had just happened was not imagined. Ghost remained where he was, calm and steady, his white coat reflecting the sterile lighting and soft gradients that made him appear less like an asset and more like a presence that had always belonged there, even before anyone admitted it. Marcus Johnson, still behind the reinforced observation glass, felt a strange stillness settle in his chest, not the absence of feeling, but the absence of conflict between what he had been trained to believe and what he had just witnessed. The analysts no longer moved their devices, no longer attempted to document or categorize. There was nothing left in the moment that could be reduced to procedural language. General Hartley finally turned slightly toward the room, but his voice, when it came, was no longer directed as command. It was directed as closure. He confirmed what had already been understood without being spoken, that the evaluation had reached a conclusion that existed outside standard metrics. Ghost's name was not spoken again as designation, but as recognition, and in that shift something subtle but irreversible settled across the space. Marcus felt it immediately, a release that did not feel like resolution, but like acknowledgement of something that had been waiting to be seen for a very long time. Ghost took one slow step back, not withdrawing, not retreating, but creating space as if the moment itself required distance to remain intact. General Hartley watched him do it without interruption, and in that simple act of allowing, the hierarchy between them dissolved entirely. The general exhaled, longer this time, and when he spoke again, it was not for the room, but for himself as much as anyone else. He referenced the past in a way that no longer required secrecy, not because it had become declassified, but because it had become undeniable. Marcus understood then that what had been hidden was never truly gone, only waiting for the right conditions to return in a form that could not be ignored. Ghost's posture remained composed, but there was a quiet readiness in him now, as if the act of being recognized had completed something essential. The general finally lowered himself back into his seat, not with fatigue, but with acceptance, and when he did, the room seemed to exhale with him. One of the analysts cleared his throat slightly, then stopped, realizing there was nothing appropriate to say that would not diminish what had just occurred. Marcus stepped back from the glass slowly, his reflection fading as he moved, as if even his own presence needed to separate from what he had witnessed in order to process it fully. He looked once more at Ghost, and in that final glance there was no evaluation left, only understanding that certain bonds exist beyond documentation, beyond erasure, beyond institutional memory. General Hartley remained seated, his gaze now calm, no longer searching, no longer testing, simply acknowledging. Ghost stood still for a few seconds longer, then shifted his attention away from the table, toward the open space of the room, as if sensing that his part in this moment was complete. Marcus felt a quiet weight lift from his thoughts, not because everything had been explained, but because explanation was no longer necessary. The analysts began to gather their materials again, but without urgency, without the expectation that anything they recorded would define what had occurred. The general gave a final nod, not as command, but as respect, and that small gesture seemed to settle the entire room into its final state. Ghost turned slightly, ready to leave, his movement unhurried, composed, and certain. Marcus watched him go, understanding that what had just unfolded would not be written fully into any official report, not because it was hidden, but because it belonged to a category of truth that existed outside structured record-keeping. As Ghost exited the chamber, the sound of his footsteps faded into the corridor beyond, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt empty. It felt complete, and in that completion, Marcus understood that some signals are not meant to be decoded as commands, but remembered as proof that nothing meaningful between trust and time is ever truly lost.